Okay, fantastic. Welcome, everybody. I know we've just started a few minutes late, but everybody is now populating the webinar. So as people join, I'm going to kick things off. Good morning. As everybody knows, I'm Andrea Durkin. I'm the current president of WIT, which is the Women in International Trade's Washington, D.C. chapter. We are joined, I know, by members of the umbrella organization OWIT from around the world. So we thank everybody for joining this very special event with Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi, for joining us. We're so excited to have you. In just a moment, Emily Beeline, who is our next president, will introduce Dr. Ngozi. And following that, Lisa Schroeder, who is our former WIT president and current president of the WIT Trust. She's going to moderate what we encourage to be a very interactive dialogue with Dr. Ngozi after she has an opportunity to make some opening remarks. As everybody knows, Dr. Ngozi is a top candidate for Director General of the WTO, but she's also a model for women around the world, having run a major ministry in her country, not once, but twice, and having held leadership roles in large international organizations. And so I'm hoping after the trade policy portion of the program, Dr. Ngozi, that you'll share some of your tips on leading as a woman, having literally written the book on the subject. And I'm also personally very interested in the perspective that you've gained running your own small business and why you felt that doing that would make you a better policymaker. I have to confess selfishly, I'm doing the exact same thing. So I'm really interested in your perspective on that. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Emily to offer you a proper introduction and get things started.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and good morning and welcome, Dr. Ngozi. Dr. Ngozi is a global finance expert, an economist, and an international development professional with over 30 years of experience working in Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America. Currently, Dr. Ngozi is chair of the board of the Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. Since its creation in 2000, Gavi has immunized 680 million children globally and has saved 10 million lives. She's also a senior advisor at Lazard and sits on the boards of Standard Charter PLC and Twitter Incorporated. Previously, Dr. Ngozi served twice as Nigeria's finance minister from 2003 to 2006 and 2011 to 2015, and briefly foreign minister in 2006, the first woman to hold both positions. As Minister of Finance in Nigeria, she spearheaded negotiations with the Paris Club of Creditors that led to the wiping out of $30 billion of Nigeria's debt, including the outright cancellation of $18 billion. She spent a 25-year career at the World Bank as a development economist, rising to the #2 position of Managing Director of Operations. In 2019, Dr. Ngozi was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2017, she received the Madeleine K. Albright Global Development Award from the Aspen Institute, the Women's Economic Empowerment Award from We Connect International, and the Vanguard Award from Howard University. And that's just a small sampling of the awards that she has won. Dr. Ngozi graduated magna cum laude with an AB in economics from Harvard University and earned a PhD in regional economics and development from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She's received honorary degrees from 15 universities worldwide, including some of the world's most prestigious colleges. She is an author. She's also a wife, a mother, and a grandmother, and we are thrilled to have her here. Lisa, happy to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Emily. And Ngozi, as we've just heard, you bring so much experience to the table, from negotiating at the family table to negotiating across multilateral institutions. And it's never been more important. I mean, it's such a challenging time for trade policy right now, and particularly for the World Trade Organization. While a lot of people are questioning the value and the capacity of this organization, we would really love to hear your thoughts on what you could bring to the role, what you would expect from the role of the next Director General. We'll welcome your thoughts, and then we can move into Q&A with our audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank you, Lisa, to thank Andrea and Emily, all three of you, for this opportunity and also for the introductions. It's exciting to, as you said, think that this group of women could get together in mid-August. Pretty exceptional. I want to start by apologizing to you if I look a little blurry. I had got a very serious eye infection this weekend. So I have some antibiotics in my eyes. I can operate, but I might look a little weird. You know, if I sound weird, please forgive me. So I would hope that this will be a very interactive session, because I also want to learn from you. I don't want it to be just a question and answer in a sense. I'd like it to be a dialogue, to also hear your concerns, you know, and what you think that a new DG should be doing. For me, trade has been a way for countries to grow, to develop, to lift millions of people out of poverty, to bring shared prosperity, to empower economically all segments of society and improve lives. So to me, you'll know that from my standpoint as a development economist, that I see trade as an essential package of the set of tools that we need in order to improve lives and to continue to build prosperity for all. So for me, trade is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. My vision is for a WTO that really underpins a multilateral trade system with purpose. And that purpose is to deliver improvements in the lives of people, and particularly to also deliver in some of the sustainable development goals that the entire universe has signed up to. And the reason I come back to the sustainable development goals, because it touches on one of the issues, or several of the issues, where I feel that trade needs to do more. And that is to deal with the excluded. We have to admit that even though we've had this wonderful multilateral trading system that has lifted lives, we know that micro, medium, and small enterprises, that there's more work to be done to ensure that these are included. We know that women in trade is an issue. And this is one of the areas I'm very passionate about, because I feel the WTO needs to update to include these areas. And I'm particularly passionate about it because I see opportunities in the era of digital, the digital economy, of e-commerce, for women and micro and small and medium enterprise. Sometimes we can even say the two together, because you know most women are running their own small enterprises. That's what we're all in, not exclusively, but many of us. And with this digital economy that is coming, it offers women an opportunity to participate. It offers small and medium enterprises an opportunity to participate, even from the comfort of their homes or wherever they are, to get on to this, provided they have the right enabling environment to do so. And this is one area where I think we can become much more inclusive with respect to the rules of trade and what the WTO does. I'm also very keen on the issue of trade and the green economy, because I think that sustainability issues are important, and that we should look at what levers we have, you know, to again update our rules and make them fit for purpose in this regard, or strengthen any existing rules that may already be on our books. We are living in a world in which we cannot escape. Just as we have this pandemic, we'll be in a fool's paradise if we don't acknowledge that issues of the environment and climate change are with us. And when I look at some of the small vulnerable economies that I'm working on in the Caribbean, for instance, now on the CARICOM Commission, and what they can be devastated and wiped out with just one hurricane that comes, you know, or one change of a weather event. And we are not talking about how to deal with these issues. That matters a lot to me. And we've seen it even in the United States, you know, a hurricane, a weather event can flatten the whole cities and certain areas, and we need to rebuild. So how do we factor in resilience and green economy issues into the way we look at trade? That's also an area. And the circular economy, I need not tell you that the present fisheries subsidies negotiations that are ongoing, I believe they're particularly important because not only do they deliver on the issues of fish, improving our fisheries and our fish stocks, not only will they deliver on that, but they will also deliver on issues of biodiversity in our oceans, which is something that is particularly important to me. So that whole constellation of issues, I think that are quite new. I would like to, it's part of what I see the WTO focusing more intently on and bringing alive. I want to add on to this the issue of the COVID-19 and the trade-related issues of healthcare products, medical supplies and equipment, vaccines. And one of the things that I'm doing now is serving as COVID-19 envoy of WHO in what is called the Tools Accelerator, where we are looking at how to accelerate production, manufacture, discovery, production of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, and their distribution and delivery in such a way that no one is left out in the world. Poor countries do not stand at the end of the queue, but we find some allocation mechanism that deals with all. And you know that at the WTO, we have some rules on issues like export restrictions. Over 90 countries, as we speak, have export restrictions that they've thrown in because of that tendency to a bit of nationalism and fear of what happens when you have a pandemic. So the restrictions are not only on medical supplies and equipment, but also on food. And it's very scary for food import dependent countries to see this. It's scary for countries that do not manufacture and are not part of the supply chain for medical supplies and equipment to see that they may not be able to get access. So what are the rules that exist? We have some rules that say that, look, countries have the right to put in export restrictions, provided they're notified, temporary, transparent, and proportionate. And so these are not expected to be long-lasting things, but how many of our 90 countries notified on putting in these restrictions on medical supplies and equipment? How many are temporary? Some of them have clearly indicated they're phasing this out, so short-term, 3-4 months. But what about the others? What do our rules have to say about this? What will happen to vaccines when they become available? How will we support a system with our trade rules that makes sure that no one is left behind? Because no one is safe in this pandemic until everyone is safe. No country is safe until every country is safe. So I'm very keen that the WTO focus on these issues and look at all the articles within the GATT, within TRIPS, that control these issues on vaccines. We'll be looking at how do you make vaccines available while still acknowledging and protecting the intellectual property of those who have created this, so that innovation and can also, and research can continue to be supported. So for me, this is off the moment. And if I were at the MC12, this is one of the issues I would try to prepare for and table at that, because I think we need to deal with it urgently. So then other issues where I feel that the WTO really needs change and challenges are confronting us, of course, with the dispute settlement system. I strongly feel that it is damaging the credibility of the WTO that there is no forum where members can bring their disputes. We have a temporary thing, the MPIA, that has been developed by the EU and others, but not everybody buys into it. The United States does not believe in it, Japan, very many other members. So how do we lift the paralysis that we have now with regard to the appellate body? Listen to what the US is saying with respect to their concerns on this system. Look at what is happening with the Walker process, which has started to put some recommendations on what should be done, and ask ourselves, are they really so far apart? Is there a way that we can focus on what is common rather than what is different? I'm finding that in this trade thing, if I want to call it that, there's so much focus on how far apart members are, how difficult it is, but there are some commonalities, and I'd like to take a different tack and ask, where are the commonalities? Where are the bridges? What can we build on? So with respect to the dispute settlement system, this is one area I would be looking at and thinking that we should get something done. And then finally, the area of the strengthening of the secretariat itself. I think that the secretariats can do a lot more to support members, to act in a more joined up fashion, as the British would say, to support members in their negotiations, in their implementation and monitoring. And then I want to add one area which I've not really been talking about, but should have been because of my finance background. I also think we need to look at the issue of trade finance. At large, this has become an issue. The Asian Development Bank has estimated that more than $1 trillion, there's a more than $1 trillion gap in demand for trade finance. This represents, you know, companies who have requested and been turned away and their demand is not met. And therefore, those goods and services they want to export with, you know, they cannot get backing for, get left behind. So what do we do about trade finance? And who is particularly hit? We can really understand quickly that medium, micro, and small enterprises do not have access to this. Women, don't have access. So what do we do at large to solve this problem? How do we get the multilateral development banks to weigh in more to make this possible? I'm happy to say that in the area of cotton farmers, in Burkina Faso, for instance, the IFC was able to come in when other banks refused to finance and finance 80% of the cotton trade. But what if they didn't come in? How can we get more of this? How do we deal with the Financial Stability Board? Because some of the issues on trade finance are regulatory, stemming from the 2008-2009 crisis, where so many the regulatory framework was strengthened in a way that made banks scared to deal with, do correspondent banking and trade finance banking and deal with some of the countries and the small corporations, organizations in these member countries, and therefore they've been left out. So that's another area that I think the WTO ought to be asking questions. I know they've been doing some work on it, but without the trade finance greasing the wheels, it will be quite difficult to carry on. So Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, what do you have to do with all this? Why do you think that you're the one who should be supported to be DG? I'll end on that note. I think that I am running for this because I strongly believe that the WTO needs a different kind of DG this time. It needs a leader. It needs a DG capable of doing reforms, not talking about it, but that actually has a track record in implementing the reforms that will be needed. It needs a DG capable of sitting with policymakers from the very top and being able to present and make the arguments about why policymakers should do the necessary things to unravel the tangles in which the WTO is now in, lift the paralysis. Some DG able to present this. The DG does not have direct power, I always say that, but the DG has soft power, and that soft power can be used proactively to make changes, and that would be the kind of DG I would be. I think that this combination that is needed now of someone who is steeped in trade from both their practice and training, who is a leader, has been known to do that, who has long years of experience in multilaterals, including managing as number 2, a multilateral, and bringing cooperation between multilaterals. Someone who combines finance also with all this. I think this unique combination, and by the way, who is in the middle of the COVID crisis and knows the issues that need to be tackled. I think that combination does not exist in any other candidate. And that is why I'm saying, support me for the position of DG. Let me leave it there.
Well, thank you, Ngozi. That was certainly, despite your in medical issue, that's a very clear-eyed vision for the WTO. So we appreciate those thoughts. As a reminder for everybody, this session is on the record. So we do want to answer Ngozi's call to action as well. I can see we're already populating a bunch of really good questions. A reminder too, for all of what I know is a very trade savvy audience as well, looking for ideas, recommendations, and things you think should be part of the new Director General's agenda as well. So feel free to contribute your thoughts and recommendations at the same time. I am going to turn to Andrea, our WIT president, to ask the first question. Andrea?
Great, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi. I'm a former negotiator myself with the U.S. government, and I love the detail issues as much as anybody else, and the wonky stuff, the appellate body, reform issues and all of that. But frankly, the general populace doesn't really care about those issues. And I love the way you talked about COVID and the issues that are really personal to all of us, and you explained it in such a personable, relatable way, which I think is so important right now. 3 years ago, I started an educational website called Trade Vistas. And we did that to engage ordinary Americans on the role of trade in their lives, in their businesses, and in their communities. Because I personally believe that trade policy and trade institutions don't work unless they work for the average person and for everyday firms. And I don't think we have license to make trade policy unless the public believes that engaging in trade, in global trade, is in their interests, and that it protects their economic freedoms and helps them tap into their full economic potential. You might be aware, when the United States enacted legislation to join the WTO, it provided for the possibility of a vote every 5 years on whether to stay in the WTO. And it hasn't been voted on for the last 25 years, but we came pretty close this summer to doing just that. And given that possibility, Trade Vistas conducted a poll on whether the average American thought we should stay in the WTO or leave. And 2/3, if you can believe it, 2/3 believed we should leave, or they were indifferent or unsure about it. And I think an indifference is as dangerous to the WTO as opposition. And so my question to you is, what would you say to the American public, not to us on the call right now as true believers in the system, but to the general American public, to convince them that the world needs WTO right now, and that it's in American interest to stay and to continue to play an influential role?
Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for that. Let me start by saying that what I totally believe, that if we cannot convince the average person that trade is important and the WTO matters to that, then we have a problem. But I'm not surprised in the US, because for multilaterals as a whole, this is not an area that they're as familiar with. But trade should have been a little bit better. So what would I say to them? I would go back a little bit into history and try to remind people to go back when they were in high school or university or whatever, to see what happened centuries ago when we had trade wars. That was because it was a free-for-all. There were no rules governing the way that countries would trade with each other. Since we had the GATT and the WTO, and later on morphed into the WTO, we've had a predictable, stable multilateral trading system with a place to govern the rules of this trade and a place for dispute settlement. And this has added to the peace of the world. I strongly believe that security and peace are so important, and that having a trade happen within a context in which there are rules is very important. So I would remind them of that and say we definitely, and we have the specter of a possible trade war facing us now. God forbid we get there. But it's not a far-fetched thing to say to people, look, trade disputes and disagreements can result in conflict, and has resulted in conflict before. So we need this in order to safeguard our security. So that's the first thing. We need the WTO for that. We should not leave. The second is to remind them that America has traded its way to prosperity and still does. And that improving the living standards of each and every one of us also depends on trade and our ability to export things to others, to import things for others. If we didn't have trade, some of the really inexpensive goods that we enjoy as ordinary consumers would be very expensive. Some of the money we earn by exporting, we would not earn. So I want to bring it down to the very nitty-gritty for them and relate it to their lives. It's this shirt you're wearing that was made in Sri Lanka, whatever. You know, this came through trade. That thin mask that you just made and sold on the internet or through Amazon to someone in Dubai, that's through trade. And therefore, we need the WTO to give us the rules that will govern this. Otherwise, we'll be in a no man or no woman's land. So this is what I would do. I don't want any highfalutin language. I'll really bring it to the essence, to the nitty-gritty, to empowering people, to shifting and changing lives, to making us more economically stable, and to bringing the security that we need in the world.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. And maybe building on that, actually, and Ngozi, what you were just describing is a lot about how building public opinion and support behind WTO and trade. But do you see that as a path to bridging the gap between the developed and the developing economies under the WTO? There seems to be so much conflict or disconnect in that a lot of developing countries, you know, feel like rules are being imposed on them. They're not seeing the same benefits or, you know, the growth, the road to prosperity, like you were just describing with the United States. How does that messaging, how does that theme help bring developing countries back on board with the idea that trade liberalization really is their path to prosperity?
This is a very good point that you put in, Lisa. I think there are two things governing the behavior of developing countries. One is a lack of trust. That has become so clear to me. So beyond the communications issue, we have to go deeper. There is a serious trust issue. And that trust comes from the fact that developing countries feel that their agenda that was agreed on by the world as the Doha Development Agenda never got fulfilled. That round was never completed. There are some issues from it, not everything, but there are some particular issues they feel are important, which they keep raising. And they don't see the kind of response to those issues that they would want to see. So, you know, I'm just articulating the way they feel, whether they are right or wrong. This is what they feel. They feel that until some of those Doha issues, three of them in particular, the issue of public stockholding for food security, making that a permanent solution to that, the issue of cotton, where four countries in particular are very impacted, the issue of special safeguard mechanisms that they would like to see, the issue of special and differential treatment, and all that was sort of underpinned in the Doha agenda. They feel that until we come to some agreement on dealing with some of these issues, that they are being overlooked. As you know, some developed country members will look, guys, this is passé. Let's move on. We've got issues of the moment here that we need to deal with, and we shouldn't go back to those issues. So I think to build trust of developing country members, we need to tackle not all, but maybe look at one or two of those issues and see if we can bring some agreement around them. You know, public stockholding for food security. There are still a few countries or members who have some issues on transparency of doing this and whether it would result in distorting trade in one way or the other, circumventing. But I feel that we can really come to some agreement on that. And if I were made DG, I would pick up one issue and see if we could drive, because I feel even achieving that would bring a lot of trust back. Two, the second issue on building trust is tackling something that is very, very important now to the developing countries, and that is this issue of the digital and digital divide. If you look at the e-commerce joint statement initiative or plurilateral negotiations, you'll find that many developing countries are not participating. They are absent, which to me is a big shame, because for me, there's no one who can even talk me out of the fact that this is a critical issue we need to quickly handle and deal with. So I keep saying to them, but you're absenting yourself from where the discussions are being made, and they don't trust. They feel, well, we have issues of the digital divide, you know, that have not been tackled, and they don't see any movement towards helping them bridge this. So as DG, this is one of the things I feel is even a little easier to deal with than, say, going back to the Doha issues, is to bring the multilaterals, the World Bank Group, the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Bank, all those, the DFC of the US that wants to be an actor in Africa and other areas. Let's sit around the table. Let us see what package of investments are needed to support some of these countries. Once they see action in trying to deal with some of their issues, that lack of trust will begin to fall away. So I'm sorry I'm spending a bit of time on it because I think it's beyond communications. Of course, we now need to then communicate that, look, some of the positions you're taking may not be beneficial to you. We can even back it up with analysis by the Secretariat. That's what I mean. If some members say, look, we are not going to join in the JSI on e-commerce because we will not benefit. Well, what's the analysis to show them that they will lose even more by staying out of it? So we need to analyze and put that on the table. We need to communicate massively about how members may be disadvantaging themselves, and then we need to build trust.
That's such a great comment. While you're on digital, and I know we've had several questions so far in the chat and the Q&A on that space, and that's a really good example, and with appreciating your idea of bringing the banks together, focusing on the infrastructure, building the space so that every country feels they have a path to be able to compete in that in the digital world is going to be really impactful. But I'm curious how you see that going that one step further, given that there's so much conflict. While there's been good progress in the e-commerce debate so far, there are a lot of broader issues clearly at stake right now when it comes to digital, whether it's digital services taxes, data flows, a lot of conflict between the trade and security space. Do you see the capacity for the WTO to really step up and lead on these issues when there's so many fractured perspectives across the membership?
I asked the opposite question. If the WTO does not step up and lead and begin to repair those fractures, who will? Which organization will? I think the WTO should take the lead and bring other organizations along. In dealing with the digital divide, we also need to build the regulatory frameworks of these countries. Many of them don't have the regulatory framework. They don't know how to manage this going forward. So that's also a gap, and that brings fear. On data flows, for instance, many countries want to localize their data. And by the way, I think we should look at this because even big countries have fears of their data being taken out. So how do we calm the fears of developing country members and say, look, some of this data, in order to make the wheels work of the trading system, we need to allow this data to flow. Yes, there may be others. Let's not put a blanket sort of cover on all of the data. Let's look at what we need to localize to protect very essential things. I would listen to that because they may have a point, and what we need to flow. And in any case, the cross-border data flow now is huge and nobody is controlling it. So let us take a serious look at what problems you have on it and deal with those, and then see what areas we can have a bit more freedom. So the WTO should play a role in doing that. I think there are some countries that have gotten together to try and see a way out of the cross-border data flow issue, but it should be an issue for the membership. And the WTO can enable that to happen. Digital taxes, this is now something of the moment, where there's disagreement on how this should transpire. It left the WTO and went to the OECD. And, some countries have also left the negotiating table at the OECD on this issue. Definitely, it's a problem that we have to tackle. I think the WTO needs to step up on that issue and try to work jointly with the OECD to come to some kind of agreement that countries can work around. Otherwise, you're going to have the situation where individual countries are just, applying their own taxes. And it will be a chaotic thing for corporations and businesses to deal with. As I sit on the Twitter board, in every single country we go into now, in Europe, countries are enacting taxes on their own. Some developing countries have started looking at that. So is there a way that we can look at this in a way that calms the fears and looks at the benefits to developing countries of this and how they can be involved, whilst at the same time taking care of the fear of the big countries? So I strongly feel the WTO cannot stand back in this. It has to cooperate with other agencies like OECD to bring an answer.
Absolutely, that convening platform is incredibly important. And you made such a great point a second ago too, when you talked about data analysis and helping countries understand genuinely what's at stake. I mean, that's a really good example of when we think about stakeholder engagement with the WTO. There's a lot that companies can contribute. Cross-border data flow is a perfect example.
Mm-hmm.
While many politicians may look at data localization as an investment opportunity, it doesn't necessarily track or really align with commercial business investment strategies these days. It's not really how it works on the ground. So the question, there's been so much that's been built in, the trade dialogues, the public forum. Many of our organizations have taken trade missions to Geneva. There's talks about maybe we should have a ministerial more than every other year.
Mm-hmm.
Many of my own sector, we've done a couple of workshops on the margins of the TBT committee, for example, to really help illustrate chemical management policy with regulators.
Mm-hmm.
How would you, in your role, in the role of DG, how would you see opportunities to make that stakeholder engagement a more practical reality in the deliberation process rather than this sort of separate sidetrack or more of an ad hoc process? How can we build more of that commercial expertise into trade and economic policy decision-making?
Well, I think that, thank you very much, that the business community is a serious, of course, stakeholder in the trade system. And if I became DG, I would be looking for not ad hoc methods, but a more systematic way of taking their views into account. Are there fora already there in which we can have their views factored in? Do we create them? These are, so I know that's the big public forum that takes place once a year. Yes, that's fine, but we need perhaps other approaches. And I would be looking at, yes, how can we bring the business in a regular fashion, not an ad hoc fashion? After all, what is this whole trade about? Who are we doing it for? I talked about bringing it down to individuals, but we also, it's all about businesses and companies being able to do their business and trade. So why don't we have their views in a systematic fashion in the rules we are trying to build, in the changes we are trying to make, in the agreements we are trying to broker? So I'm not saying that, when members are negotiating, they should be at the table. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that we need to find really more institutionalized ways of taking these views into account. Ditto for civil society. I would like to also work more with them to see. And then there are certain issues. For example, if we start dealing with the issue of COVID-19 and the medical supplies and vaccines and equipment, I think those are areas where you need business actually as part of the stakeholder at the table. Being party to, because you can't do it without the agreement and they're signing on. So I would see them as participating in this. Maybe this is a bit brave, but really to cut through some of these problems, that is the way I would go about it. I'm also part of those who share the view that maybe a ministerial every 2 years in a world where there's constant and dynamic change, and innovation and technology is moving so fast that every 2 years is not really adequate. We ought to make it and bring it closer to every year. You can see changes happening, under your nose. So I might be very partial to having a yearly ministerial, because the world has changed and it's changing so fast that if you wait too long to bring issues on the table for ministers to consider and look at, you might be missing some boat, or you find yourself lagging behind. So yes, More stakeholder forums that are institutionalized, including for business. Yes, to more frequent ministerials.
Well, I think you would find a very willing constituency to engage with you on that. Similarly, I know a number of our folks have asked about the SDGs and your comments around where trade can really enable, and maybe a comment or a suggestion and a question. And I know we've had a chance to talk previously a little bit about, like, when you think about a lot of the environmental SDGs, you know, while we have the specter of, you know, the environmental goods agreement that didn't really kind of get over the finish line, there's a lot of opportunities to really focus on investment in environmental technologies by looking at what are the real barriers. And very often that falls into the regulatory or investment policy space. You know, one suggestion would be looking at the investment facilitation talks, as that focuses a lot on the policy arena. That also becomes an opportunity, as you've talked about. We want to build trust, demonstrate the facts of what's at stake with investment, and really promote not just environmental, but economically sustainable projects. That could be one really good path forward to open this agenda and focus these talks towards the reality of investment, which can help provide clean technologies, you know, create jobs, solve poverty issues, capacity building for workforce. How do you see, as you think about the SDG agenda aligning with trade policy, how can we really take that from, you know, a conversation everybody has to an agenda everybody's genuinely working on?
I think that the road you've taken through investment facilitation is a very is a fascinating one, because it opens up fresh vistas and avenues. And I noticed that more and more members, that's also a plurilateral negotiation, but I think more and more members are coming in because they do want investment. They do want to create the policy environment that will enable investment to come in. This is something that developing country members, along with developed, also understand. I think that the idea of, you know, let's do it better. If we are going to have a new agreement, let's not have it in the old way. Let us consciously build in investment into green technologies and rules that would facilitate those. And in a way that almost all members will see is beneficial to them, not taken away from them. Now you look at, let's take specifically the area of energy and renewables. And, you know, how do we, this is an area in which there's a comparative advantage in a way for many developing countries. Let's take my own continent, you know, the raw material, which is sunshine, is there. You know, how do we facilitate trade and a policy environment on those inputs that are needed to invest in this green technology? If you look at the policy environment specifically in many countries, you might find that customs duties and tariffs actually discriminate against some of these inputs that are coming in rather than be supportive of them. So you know, you have to look across at very granular. What are you, if you say you want to facilitate trade and promote green investment and green technology, what are your own rules and policies actually looking at with behind borders? And, you know, encourage members to look at these issues to make it easier for solar panels to come in, or for them to get investment to manufacture those within their countries, which is what many would be interested in. What do you have to do in this investment facilitation agreement to attract investment in green technologies within your borders? So I would go very specific, taking it technology by technology. And I think, you know, the reason I'm fascinated by renewables is that the cost of solar, for instance, has come down. It's so competitive now with that of fossil fuels and other means. And if we can demonstrate that to countries, we can make trade agreements that promote this rather than militate against it. And we can look at the fossil fuel and high carbon emission technologies and look at how we disincentivize the use of those, whilst building a transition program for those members who have this as their primary way of earning a living. You know, my country is one of them, you know, so you have to think of transition in all these arrangements, because overnight you can't expect countries to just close out on this, but to edge them on the way to the proper green technology and agreements that facilitate this. I think this would be definitely the way to go.
Thank you. And that kind of plays into several questions have been raised about the functionality of the WTO. And as you know, the trade agenda out there right now, you've got a lot of countries taking unilateral actions, whether it's tariffs or other border measures, you know, very much working against the broader trade liberalization agenda. You've got a lot of countries who are not fulfilling their obligations to the WTO. You mentioned it previously when we think about even the TBT commitments and obligations. You know, there have been a lot of countries looking to benefit from the organization without necessarily meeting the full criteria, and that certainly plays into when we think about the negotiating agenda. You know, you mentioned the value of plurilaterals, and that brings up the question of, you know, should that be about the coalition of the willing, the beneficiaries ought to be the ones engaged? Maybe we should be reconsidering the MFN principle. When you think about that functionality, as you said, with the DG's role, that soft power leadership, how to get countries back to the table in terms of fulfilling their obligations and committing to that WTO agenda, not just looking at what they're taking away.
Well, this is a big issue because, as you said, all sorts of neglect of the rules and non-compliance by members can be seen in certain ways, and it's becoming proliferating in a way. And you can also see the move away from WTO that in bilateral, increase in numbers of bilateral and regional trade agreements that are ongoing. And that is why I'm very, very concerned about the WTO and the restoration of image, because now that it has this image of being dysfunctional, things not working, members are saying, why should I engage with it? Why not make my own bilateral agreement and engage in a regional trade agreement? But we know that ultimately what benefits the multilateral trading system and the world more, and you know, to have every member engaged. Number one, it reduces transactions costs when you have all 164 members. So when we talk about plurilateral negotiations, I would like to see them move. I would not like to see the MFN principles, you know, put aside. I want to instead see these move more to multilateralize them over time by engaging all the countries. There are reasons why countries are not stepping up to the plate. And you can see it. I've told you one for digital e-commerce is because of the fear of commitments, taking on obligations when you feel you don't even have the basic regulatory framework or infrastructure. You go to investment facilitation, more and more members are coming onto that, but there are certain fears that are there. And I think that I'm very firmly that the multilateral is the best way, and that we need to do everything to facilitate it. Yes, plurilateral, we don't have to be stuck in the mud. If it can move certain issues along, yes, but it's not the ultimate objective. We should be asking ourselves the questions, how can we, to the best extent possible, get a plurilateral to become a multilateral? That's the way that I would go. Because I think ultimately that's more beneficial to the world. A world in which some are left out and some are negotiating is not really a good one for the membership. And I want to sound the signal. If the WTO does not reform, change its image and engage, you have more and more of this behavior. You have, you know, increase in TBTs, QRs, which again is scary for smaller members. You know, how do they navigate these, for instance? So I think we really need to wake up and get the WTO to take on the proper role so we avoid an escalation. And I want to mention one thing in the G20, recent G20 finance ministers meeting. They have a trade group, and they put out a part of the communique. I don't know if you saw that, where they laid out a reform program for the WTO. And they were asking for the, what do you call it? Not permission, what's the right word? For the support to embark on discussing these reforms within the context of the G20. Can you imagine that? Where a set of reforms that an organization that concerns the multilateral trading system and the WTO is not being discussed within the arena of the WTO, but it's now being shifted to the G20. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It could be good because you have all the policymakers in the G20, but it should be that WTO is working very closely with that trade group, not for the trade group to be saying, let's get on with this, but where's WTO in that? They should be saying, let's get the WTO in, let's work, support them to sort these out. So sorry for a long answer, but you know why I'm saying all this is because I'm very concerned with what you said. More and more and more and more action is moving out of the arena of the WTO into other fora or being done unilaterally by countries, and that's not right.
Very strong points. And we do want to be respectful of your time. So maybe as a closing question, and I want to echo, there have been a number of really great comments in the chat and in the Q&A, very strong support for your candidacy in this position, but especially what you bring as a role model. When we think about women leadership across the world these days, it's certainly timely that the WTO should be focusing on gender diversity. But I want to go back to the point Andrea made in her beginning introduction too. You have had such a historic career so far. We know you're still going to keep doing great things. But along the way, you've learned a lot of lessons in terms of how to bring that soft power and that leadership into these roles, particularly as you be coming into a bureaucracy that has a lot of bureaucracy to it. You know, how do you see, what lessons would you share with our community in terms of, you know, moving in, taking on such an existing strong bureaucratic structure and being able to really take that on as an empowered woman leader and really be able to make the kind of changes that you're talking about? What has helped you in the past as you've built this incredible career?
Well, thank you so much. You know, I have to share, I don't know if people can see the book that has just come out, Women and Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons, with Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia, is my co-author. And it's because of these kinds of questions that we decided to write this book, to share the experience. We first thought of sharing just our own two experiences as women leaders. And then we thought, no, let's enrich it. And we interviewed 8 other women leaders across the world, and we drew lessons from that. But from my own particular vantage point as a woman leader, women leaders often come in when there are problems. You know, I don't know, we call it the glass cliff. You know, you have the glass ceiling, but you also have the glass cliff when a situation is so problematic. And then, you know, women are brought in very often because nobody else wants to touch the job with a long barge pole, or you're just brought into a situation. And what I've learned is to be very humble in approaching these kinds of difficulties. Yes, you need to study the situation and of course come with a vision and an idea of where you want to go, but don't come in with a blueprint that, you know, says I'm coming in to do this, to do that. I'm very humble in approach. I've learned that. Go into the place, spend some time to study the situation that you're in. You don't lose anything by it. When the people you're working with are going to be working with feel listened to, involved, and taken into account, they'll be less likely to resist change. You know that when you're trying to reform and make change, there will be the 25% who will sign on immediately and say that this is great. There'll be 25% at the bottom who will say never. And there'll be the 50% in the middle, whom if you can convince might go along with you. So you have to know this segmentation and catch the 25% willing and those in the middle to move your reforms. To do that, they need to see a plan that involves them. They need to feel listened to. So that's what I've done in my career. And then the other thing I learned is please start with some wins. Some quick wins. Do not go in tackling immediately the most mind-boggling problems. Build out a program in which you can actually accomplish some wins with those you're working with, be it the members, be it the secretariat. And in the case of WTO, there are some potential wins that with a little bit of work, one could get. And then that begins to show people, wow, there's a way out of this. That's been the lesson of my career in doing reforms. As a finance minister, we did so many reforms in my country. I'm the longest serving, 7 years over 2 terms in the country. And that was the way I approached it. At the World Bank, the same thing. You look for things that are wins, and then you build on that. So that's my advice to women. Second is commitment. There are 2 things that govern the way I've gone about my career. One is it must be a job or an assignment. I wake up in the morning wanting to go to 70% of the time. I'm not saying 100%. I have the 70-30 rule. I must be willing to jump out of bed to go to it. Sometimes it's because it's fun and you're learning as you're delivering. Other times it's because it's commitment. I mean, as I always say, no one can say being a finance minister is fun. It's very difficult, but I certainly had such a degree of commitment to it to try and help my country build out the reforms as coordinating minister of the economy that would be needed and as finance minister. So I had that motivation to jump out. Other jobs I've done within the World Bank, they were fun. What I'm doing now at Gavi, you know, both commitment and fun. And that has really driven my career. Hardly have I ever gone, and in fact, going for this WTO teach is one of the few times that I went out and said, I'm seeking a job. But, you know, I've gone about it looking for those assignments. And that has marked my leadership approach to find things that I'm committed to, that I can be engaged in no matter the challenge, because that means I will give it my all. And that automatically, when people see you giving your all, you may not have gone into it because you wanted a big promotion, but just because you wanted to deliver, you get that you get propelled, you get that leadership situation that you wish to be in. So those are some of, and of course, balancing in doing all of that, all of us women have this challenge. And this is one of the things we talk about in the book. You know, Jacinda Ardern is one of the women we interviewed, the first or second prime minister to have a child in office. And the question of how do you be a prime minister so visible at the same time you have family issues to take care of. And we found out that there's no blueprint, there's no formula. You just work on it and you try to make it work, as she said. So for me also in managing my private life along with this career, 4 children and some grandchildren that we brought up, I try to manage it, make it work. And a lot depended on having a spouse who valued your own career as much as his own. And I was very lucky that that was, that I had that. And so I had a very supportive atmosphere. So all this helped me. I think I did get propelled into leadership because I had the supportive environment at home to make it possible. I didn't feel like I was battling on the home front to prove why I should be doing it. I felt a wind behind my back. So if you can create those circumstances, that can really be good. Because let me end on this. There are times in this leadership role when you need to cry. When you need to admit that it's so tough. And if you have a good home, and there's nothing, you know, they say, look, when women cry, people think they're soft. No, some of our women admitted that there's no embarrassment in it. Men cry too. They just hide it better. You know, if you need to do that, you need a supportive environment in which to do it. And you know, so that is, let me stop on that note.
But that is such incredible advice and great recommendations. And candidly, that's really our mantra here with Women in International Trade. With DC, our global parent, OWIT, we're a community. You know, when you talk about building that supportive environment, you know, creating the community where you can bring women and men, we do allow for gender diversity, bring everybody together, especially when we're so passionate, as you clearly are, about the topics of trade and how we put the WTO back at the forefront of the trade agenda. So I know I speak for everybody when I say this has been such great fun and a real win for us. It's an inspiration to talk to you. Know that you have built a very strong fan base across our community. We will be posting this on the website too. So for everybody who participated, for all of your friends and colleagues who couldn't join us today, you can feel free to share this with them afterwards, especially so that they can hear the inspiring comments that Ngozi has given us today. We can't thank you enough for participating. We wish you every success in your candidacy, and know that we look forward to continuing to work with you, because whatever you do, you bring such value to the trade agenda, and we are your loyal partners.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege and an honor and fun too. And I hope if I succeed, or I feel very positive, so I should say when I succeed, that we'll have more to do with each other. And you know, trade can be fun. Thank you.
Absolutely. And of course, everyone should be buying the book, because there's a lot of great advice included in there. Thank you, Ngozi. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Andrea. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.